Hey, everybody, it's Darin Francis with Harbinger Lane, and this is Signals in Higher Ed. Today, I have with me Andrew Salmon, the co founder of Intangled Learning. Welcome, Andrew.
Glad to be here.
Uh, Andrew, we've been talking on this podcast for, I think we're going on 35 weeks of content specifically focused on experiential learning. We've talked to people internationally and domestically from the higher ed perspective. We've talked to many of the companies that build content or platforms or services to support experiential learning. And you and I and your co-founder Kevin have had a few conversations to this point, enough for me to feel like what you're doing in this space definitely intersects, and I want to get into it. But I think that we need to kind of first start a little bit so that people understand what your company is all about. And I'm going to give my perspective, and you can fill in the blanks. But Entangled Learning is building degree pathways where the learner's work drives the curriculum instead of the other way around. How do you feel about that definition of entangled learning?
I like it a lot. Probably use that. No, I think in the higher ed sense, yeah, that's pretty spot on. We would say that typically when you think about curriculum, you think about a structured text-based curriculum that's developed by faculty or even another company. The way we think about the type of learning that we do, which is organizational learning, there are practices within an organization, whether it's a school district or a manufacturer or any organization, and our view is that the practices of that organization are the curriculum. And so when we talk about the language you used was work-driven learning, I think is how you described it. We would say that the student, they are researching the practices of that organization, and the practices are serving as the curriculum.
Okay. Yep. Well, we've got to jump more into that. We've got time to do it. But first, let's talk a little bit about how you got into this. How did you and Kevin meet, and what made you decide to start working in this problem space?
So I'll start with where I met Kevin, my co-founder. We met in a K through 12 classroom. It was a math classroom, actually. I was not a teacher, so I was actually I studied the construction sciences, so I was a builder. So I built commercial buildings for about 10 years, but I started to get this itch for education. And so I started doing volunteering for industry mentorship. So I was going into schools, and I was actually sort of sponsoring, mentoring the disengaged students. And there was one school in particular that I was mentoring at, and then Kevin comes in the room, gives a speech to the students, something about math. And I said, I haven't heard anybody talk to students in that way. And so I went and engaged with Kevin, and then we socialized for a couple of years. I think what was driving me in that scenario was, growing up, I did pretty poor at school. I was not very engaged. I was actually at one point my junior year of high school, I was completely failing all my classes. My dad pulled me out of baseball, which was the wake up call. I never actually thought he could do that. Not because he didn't have the authority to, but I just didn't think he could, because he loved to go to my games. So when he pulled me out of baseball, I knew it was serious. I was like, there's I gotta something, I'm impacting others. And then, so I always had this curiosity about why did I not engage in that experience? And I thought I hated learning. But Kevin and I, fast forward after we met during COVID, we got together, and it was like, hey, what's something in education we could go and do? And we noticed that schools were they were posting teaching positions like crazy. At the time, people were leaving education like crazy. COVID was very hard on schools. So Kevin picked up the phone. He started calling schools and said, "Hey, we can fill your math vacancies." And they said, "Well, how are you going to do that?" He said, "Well, we're going to figure out how to train people who want to do the work to be math teachers." Looking back, we actually probably had no idea what we were doing, even though he was a math teacher and I had come from industry. So I was very familiar with workforce development and apprenticeship and all those sorts of things. And so that just, over the last 5 years, what we thought for a while we were a math organization. And it wasn't until recently we realized, we looked at all the work we're doing across education, across industry, and we just noticed a unique philosophy and theory about how learning happens in practice. And so we came up with this, like, what are we really? What is it we really do? And when we looked at the work, the consistent pattern in K-12, in manufacturing, no matter what environment we're working in, we're trying to move organizations from having people practicing in isolation and more so entangling them in shared practice. So mentors, apprentices, leadership, entangling everybody so that there's a shared practice where learning can actually happen. And there's quite a bit of science behind it, but that's the basic idea, is that when you get the entanglement right within the organization learns. And then people learn as a result of that, and their practice develops, as opposed to, I'm an individual doing my thing in my space, leave me alone, and I'll give it, if you need something from me, I'll give it to you. So a lot of teaching is definitely thought of as a very isolating profession. And we think it's a community practice. So that's kind of what we're after in terms of the uncomfortable truth, is helping organizations realize that you have a shared practice here.
Mm. And I see already that your work, given the mission and the uncomfortable truth, can sort of feed across different sectors. Let's talk about them a little bit further. So, in the higher ed context, where the majority of our audience comes from, you've actually worked with higher ed institutions training K-12 teachers. Mm-hmm. And we all know there's a teacher shortage. We all know there's a lot of burnout. People get into the teaching profession and it's not at all what they thought it was going to be. And so talk about like what you do in practice in that context of training teachers, and why that's different than sort of the status quo. Maybe that would be a good starter point, I think.
So I'll probably start with the sort of the traditional approach to training a teacher. Most people, when they think about becoming a teacher, and I've had to learn all this. So my co-founder was a teacher. He went through this experience. Our VP of Academic Affairs was a teacher. She went through this experience. Basically, for a traditional student, you go to college, you do a 4-year degree, you take coursework, which is kind of like exposing you to the practices, the best practices of education, maybe some theory. I don't think a lot of people understand what theory is. I think that's a side problem if we get a chance to talk about. But and then by the end of the experience, you typically will do your student teaching. So the last semester, you will go to a school where you'll do your clinical, and they call it student teaching or residency. So that's for your 18 to 22-year-old student. For adult learners, it can look very similar. They're taking the coursework while they're in the classroom. And then at some point, they're going to do their formal student teaching, where it's during that student teaching, the university will observe and they will actually check for competency from their interpretation of what competent practices are. So that's, you could call it, theory first, practice second. And my view is that that's actually a fine arrangement. I don't think that there's an issue. I think there's multiple ways into knowing a profession, and starting with theory is legitimate, but also starting with practice is legitimate. But you need both. So our approach, I would say, is it's practice first, but theory closely connected. What we are doing, we have an apprenticeship-based approach. Apprenticeship is all the rave right now, within education. But the way we think about apprenticeship is these are adults. They're not 12-year-olds in the guild. This is also not Karate Kid, where we have a Mr. Miyagi. So there's not this, like, I call it the Mr. Miyagi syndrome. What we have is an adult that is working in an organization that is part of a community of practice. So we really draw on the community practice literature, but we basically position that adult as a researcher in the practices of the organization. And so the apprentice, they are earning credit. Now I'm speaking specifically about education here. They're earning college credit for researching and uncovering the practices of their school. What are the instructional strategies? Why were those selected? What were the trade-offs in those decisions? How do we use technology? I'm developing a reflective practice, and what they're doing is they're surfacing how people are actually practicing teaching in their school, and that is the curriculum. That is where the practice of teaching happens. And then where we go from there is you've got all these, like, over a period of 2 years, the educator is building what we call a practice portfolio. So imagine like a collection of narratives about the work being done in the school along very specific areas of practice. And then along the way, they identify areas that they want to go deeper in theoretically. Like there's an area in their practice that they feel like in order for them to really improve, they need to actually go and study that academically. And so we set up a research course. And so this is kind of the idea of like work generated learning that we're working on. It's a practice driven curriculum. There's probably a lot of ways to describe it, but it's a basic idea of positioning the student as a researcher in practice, them developing narratives of practice, their own practice as well as their community, and then identifying areas of the practice that they need to take to a theoretical level that they can study through the academic discipline of higher ed. So,
and how is that? So now contrast that again for me. Like, how is that different from how they do it today? Is it the fact that what you've done is front loaded into the apprenticeship more of the practice and building the curriculum around the research that the student is doing so that they're learning theory in the practice? Or have they still gone through all that, the theoretical training first, and now they're applying it in the apprenticeship in a different way?
Okay, so I think here's the key move that we've made. When you think about a traditional curriculum, that curriculum is valuable because it mirrors what the actual practices that are happening in education. So, or any given field. Well, the move we made, we said, why would we? They are actually in the practice environment where those practices are actually happening. There's a context, there's a student, there's accountability, there's local judgment on if people are doing a good job or not. And so we don't really need to really go into all of these, use a curriculum that's representative of the practices. The practices are right there. And so that's the move we made. And we said, let's just, like, having a structured curriculum that's representative of practices is better than nothing. But the best thing you could possibly have is the actual practices themselves. The problem with apprenticeship approaches historically have been that they require a lot of time. because there's been a metaphor of, or an image of an apprentice as they are there just to imitate the master teacher. And that's not what we see when we actually look at apprenticeship communities in history. And so the way we position that apprentice is they are there as a researcher investigating the curriculum, being the practices of the organization, where teaching actually happens. And that to us is the most organic, the most authentic curriculum possible.
Yep. Yeah. So do you get pushback at from either, in this case, in the teaching environment, do you get pushback on this methodology either in the community of practice in the school, or do you get pushback at the the higher ed institutional level about this? Like, is there friction? You're cutting against the grain here, and I'm trying to understand like where concerns lie, because this is new and it's different. It's a different way to manage an apprenticeship, although apprenticeships aren't that widely applied true apprenticeships aren't that widely applied in teacher training. Like, they are starting to be, but they're still at the early stage. But yeah, what pushback do you get, and from where, if anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, within schools, I'll start where we don't get pushback. I don't experience pushback in schools because they know. A lot of times district leaders, school district leaders went through the traditional experience. So it takes a minute for them to kind of understand what's going on and what we're proposing. Once they get it, some really get super passionate about it. The educators really resonate with it because if they are working in a school all day long, and then now they got to go do college coursework at night. They're often making a trade-off. Do I do college coursework, or do I prepare for work tomorrow? We said we just collapse that. You don't have to make that trade-off as much anymore. Higher education, and this gets probably into a broader conversation, is the programs are very codified in terms of how they're accredited. And it seems to me that what prevents higher ed from accepting new models, new ideas such as this, is not so much accreditation, but when those programs were made, the process that underlies the program that developed it, a lot of times those people are no longer there, or they've moved on. And so what you have is faculty, usually when they think about making changes, they think about how are they going to defend it to their accreditors. And so that becomes the rub, is how do we help them see that you don't have to make substantive changes. We can take, there's two approaches here, but that's the rub usually. I honestly haven't had much disagreement at a philosophical level. It really comes down to, are we checking standards, and can we defend this to accreditors? I personally have yet. Kevin would give you probably a different experience, but my experience has been, we can't do that because of accreditation. So it takes a willing faculty, and we have found some, to be able to say, okay, basically at the end of the day, the accreditors are going to look and they're going to say, how are you assessing progress towards the course objectives? Like, what assessments did you have throughout the course, and those sorts of things? And it's up to us to be creative to show how in our process we can actually map and demonstrate that for them. But it does take a willing faculty member to actually collaborate with us and be collaborative on meeting that assessment requirement.
Yep. Where do you see, like, and how soon do you see the ROI from a, a change like what you're proposing? Um, because it feels like there's immediate steps of getting this designed, approved, and implemented, um, that go through a level of formality at any given institution, that in order to go through that work to launch this program with Intangled Learning, um, they've got to see the need. I think you're expressing a pretty good, clear indication that there's a need, whether they agree or not. But I mean, obviously they do. But yeah, how soon do they see, and what does the ROI? What does success look like?
At the institutional level?
Yeah. Yeah.
Ultimately, it has to lead to higher enrollment. It
Okay.
has to create. I mean, if I'm an institution, and the partnership we have right now, and the partnerships we're in conversations with, ultimately there has to be some business case around the enrollment. So, is this going to create a differentiation in the market for us as a university? I think a lot of times, I've heard it said that higher ed thinks it has a marketing problem. And what I see, what I have seen, is that it's, when you think about an organization selling a product, yeah, you need to have a competent sales and marketing, strategy and go-to-market strategy. But at the end of the day, you can only put so much sizzle on the steak. Like the steak,
Right.
actually, it may sound good coming out of the kitchen, but it actually, people wise up and they start to ask questions. Well, that sounds good, but what about this? And so you can only spin things so many ways. At some point, you have to deliver something substantially different. And so I think for a
Yep.
lot of higher ed right now, most of them are not delivering anything substantially different. It's the same thing. It's the same content. And you can, frankly, you can only deliver so much value with content. It's the
Yes.
experience at the end of the day that is going to have to be differentiated. And the experience for many is the same. I do this online course. I join a discussion board once a week. I'm speaking specifically adult learners here usually. I do my reading. I do my reflection in the discussion board. That's my assignment. That's the experience.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And you're taking this to another level by giving the learner greater control of uh, uh, of the overall experience, greater ownership, right? In the context of their community of practice, which I love. And so a lot of the ROI would be, a differentiated curriculum that has greater outcomes on the other end. Now, I would imagine the greater outcomes naturally lead to, less attrition,
Mm-hmm.
once someone's landed in the workforce, and greater alignment, greater value add to the institution that they're training up in, and job placement. But have you gotten that far to see those types of outcomes? Or what have you seen so far, like on the teacher side?
Yeah, I mean, we're early in the challenge with these models is that they take years. And,
Yes.
so we've been doing this for this approach to learning we've been developing for 3 years. And so the initial cohorts we've done are very positive, in terms of 90% of the educators that complete the program still in their schools, their original schools that they were doing that at. Now that's a very small in size. We're not talking hundreds of students there. We're talking like 20 or less for this specific program. We're starting to grow this program now based on these principles. And I think the thing that, some of this you have to really look at a theoretical level to guide the program and the practice. And when you look at why people quit and burn out and quit a profession, loneliness and lack of support is always number one.
Mm-hmm.
Pay is on the top 5 list, but it's loneliness and lack of support. What is being communicated with that is that they are not socially connected within their community. Yep. And so when you think about the learning experience of becoming a teacher, is the program propagating that experience or is it resolving it? Well, if the program is situated where it's all about you as an individual learning this content and these skill sets, it's probably propagating that culture of practice that's isolating.
Right.
Where this is a social approach to learning. This is the fundamental assumption here is that this is a we, not a me practice. And the reason we call it entangled is because you need to get tangled up in your organization, like in practice. And it sounds messy. That's because it is. But we have these and now I'm going to get off on a deeper philosophical bend here. Like the whole formal education culture has been this very efficiency-based, individual, measurable learning experience. And it's a very narrow and confined view of knowing and learning. Once you step into an organizational context, that doesn't work. People have to rely on each other socially. They scaffold their knowledge off of each other. It's a very different learning approach to learning, and higher ed has not recognized it. They haven't really paid attention to the 40 years of literature around what we know about that. So, yeah, I think we're early in the process, but I think when you assess it from a plausibility standpoint, what's more likely to lead to higher retention? Is it a learning experience that just focuses on their cognitive adoption of this content, or this experience that says, hey, this is an organizational approach. You are part of a community. Here are concepts and frameworks for you to go out and engage with that community, because that's a part of the experience. Is we give them, we do a collective reflections with them, introducing concepts that they can go and ways of interpreting and engaging with their community. And what we're doing is helping them ask better questions, helping them have better conversations. The goal of the program is that they are deeply embedded within their community at the end of the program.
Yeah. So I want to take us out of the teaching scenario. I know that's where you've been, but when we spoke before, one of the things that kind of caught my eye about this is that you have created almost a framework for this community of practice approach that applies cross-disciplinary, like it's independent of teaching, on into manufacturing. You've done some work there, and I wonder if you just sort of take a broad lens. You don't have to think about it from a teacher education perspective. What does higher ed get wrong when it interprets competence from outside the practice of a community? And how easy is it to sort of help them see that?
I think the problem is stated really cleanly in the question.
Yeah.
For anybody to try to, well, I'll back up with a broader problem. We've been tempted for a very long time. It's not even completely higher ed to be able to interpret things from a distance without having to actually engage at the local level.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the temptation. And I don't know that we can or should completely get away from that. But I think when you look at the practical problems that creates for learners and their organizations, it's kind of the tail wagging the dog. And that's how people talk about it, like this learning experience. They don't really call it a learning experience. It's this thing I have to do. It's kind of like I got to take my medicine, and and so the idea that you can interpret what competence means in someone else's community of practice that you're not a part of, I think there's something really out of place about that. And so what we think the way out of that is, right now, Etienne Wenger, he was the one who coined communities of practice, and um, he talked about boundary communities. And so we talked to our apprentices about, hey, you're a member in multiple communities of practice. So we actually equip them with the language and concepts to be able to navigate this issue at the student level, because they feel that friction. And so I'm an educator. I'm working, all day long on very hard problems at my school in this special education classroom. I'm exhausted. I've got this higher education program that's saying I need to do these things this way. I got to submit it in Microsoft Word. If I don't submit it in Microsoft Word, if I do a PDF, I'll get a 0. But
Right.
I got to show up tomorrow, and I've got 15 families that are, expecting me to give them a call tomorrow. So who in that scenario is the most central community of practice? Is it this program where I got to make sure I got to make sure I do Microsoft Word, not PDF, or these 15 families, these kids that have needs, and then my employer? So it's kind of obvious, right? So what we say, the the way out of this for higher education, one, is to recognize that situation. And I'm talking specifically about working adults. They have an active practice. I haven't. I think the way out of this is to get rid of the distinction of traditional versus non-traditional student. I have not found that to be a helpful distinction.
Yeah.
When thinking about how the learning experience should be designed. I have found the language we came to was pre-practitioner and active practitioner.
Mm.
So pre-practitioner, 18-year-old student on college campus, I have nothing really to say about that experience. So my concern is really about the active practitioner who has all these demands. They have a central community of practice. I think higher ed actually is missing an opportunity to drive immense value, and they're serving as a potential distraction for a lot of folks.
Yep. Well said. I wonder about give us this example now from the manufacturing side. Like, so to talk about, we're talking in the context of higher ed, but I actually feel like I might learn more about where this fits in higher ed to hear you talk about how you would work inside of an organization, a manufacturing organization, how you would apply this same model there. So give us an example and walk us through it in that context.
Yeah, so I'll give you the example, and then I want to make sure to connect it back to higher ed from a level of analysis for higher ed.
Yeah.
So I love this project that we've been doing. We've been working with this high-skilled manufacturing environment. What they do is they repair industrial motors, rotating equipment. So this is very large equipment coming into their facility. The work is non-standardized. You cannot standardize the work. It's highly variable because it's infrastructure, basically. So infrastructure goes out, a power plant goes down, the equipment gets sent to their shop. They break it down, rebuild it, get it back out as fast as possible. They tried for 15 years to figure out how to do an apprenticeship program. They tried all the off-the-shelf approaches. And so when we met with them about a year ago, they said, well, what are you going to do that's different? Because we've been trying all these different things and they haven't been working. We said, well, what'd you do? And they told us. So we said, okay, here's a couple ways that we're different. Here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to we're not going to become experts in what you do. So we're going to help you build this apprenticeship program, but we're not going to be experts in what you do. In fact, just consider us clueless in what you do the entire time. You're not hiring us. You get for that. You guys are the experts. You have an existing business. You know what you do, but you don't know how to understand what you do. That's your problem. You don't know how to understand the knowledge that you have. Number two, we're not going to start with a rubric. Forget the rubric. Take it off the wall because they had a rubric. We're going to start with a rubric because we're not going to come up with a bunch of assumptions on what we think people need to know. Again, you have practices that are happening in your organization. You have a successful organization. The knowledge is already there. We need to figure out how to understand it. And then number three, we're not going to make you wait 2 years to hire an apprentice, because that's a lot of programs will say, we're going to start by hiring apprentices. Because we need the apprentices to help understand how people can access learning here. Otherwise, we're just making assumptions. And that's the most critical thing, is understanding how do new people access the practice-based knowledge here. And so we hired a couple apprentices. Well, they hired the apprentices. They put them out on the floor, and then we had the apprentices collect narratives of their work with the mentor. So you start to surface some of those insights on what kind of decisions are being made, and that, because that's where knowledge is used. Knowledge is used where decisions are made. So we have tools and concepts to be able to do these things today that I don't think we had 40 years ago. But then once you can understand that, the next level is, how do you, who are the senior people that can take ownership of this learning? And so now you start to form these councils of mentors, and they take ownership of the program. So that's the entanglement is starting to happen. That's where the local judgment of competence happens. That's where the interpretation happens. It's within that you're starting to form that community, not so much form the community practice, but just recognize it, that it exists, and adding some helpful structure for it. And then you can grow the apprenticeship program from there. The apprentices are researchers. And I'll say this, and then I'll move on to the last part of this, is that in all of these cases that we've engaged in so far like this, the metaphors, while industry will typically be negative about our formal education system, the way they think about their learning is like the formal education system. And so we have to, the first thing we have to do before we do anything is we have to clean all that up. This is not school. You have an active practice. You can't have people, when you're in school, a person needs to learn everything possible to be able to pass the test. That's not possible or even desirable in an organizational environment. So it's a completely different learning theory that's involved. And so the last part of this is the challenge for higher ed in this scenario is that analyzing that is, you can see how hard that would be to analyze. If you've got to fit things into the, this nice, you've got all these standards that line up to accreditation. It's much easier to measure an individual and what they're learning. And because you've broken everything into units, I could go into the history of how we got here, but it's a very clean, measurable system. The problem is it doesn't even come close to the human experience of learning.
Right. It's factory oriented almost. It's linear. And you're suggesting that it's actually the entanglement and the community that creates the learning moments that get cemented and establishes the practice. Talk about the role of the mentor in this space, right? Because there is you left me with the Mr. Miyagi image from before. And so how is Miyagi different in this context?
So I love The Karate Kid. One of the things I do, I grew up watching The Karate Kid. One of the things I do when we do onboarding and we bring apprentices in, we bring mentors in, I say, here's all the things we think about with apprenticeship. It's in the modern mind about apprenticeship. And I have Mr. Miyagi on there.
Sure.
And so most people think about a mentor as like they do a teacher, with a structured curriculum, and the apprentice is mirroring the motions of the mentor. And the mentor is organizing the learning of the apprentice. So you have this kind of like gatekeeper of knowledge that's, you know, um, instructing, but also restricting of what the apprentice has access to. So the famous, sand the fence, wax the car, that whole thing. Like, oh, finally it clicked for Daniel's son. He's been teaching me the whole time, and we love that, right? Like we love that. The other metaphor, so I call that the Mr. Miyagi syndrome. Um, the other metaphor is this kind of like, I'm seeing it more right now because of registered apprenticeship and all these things. It's just more like machine, like mechanical image of apprenticeship. Of we can top down design some best practices for apprenticeship and then put them into an organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to go into all the problems with that approach, but you can imagine it's just imagining that people just put things into practice. I think the assumption, this machine metaphor, is I'm very careful about how we use the word design, because when it comes to human systems, and this is true for tools too, curriculum in a school or some new tool adoption, tools do not get designed into practice. Programs do not get designed into practice. They're negotiated. And so you can see why people have avoided this, right? Because it sounds messy. But the only way to have ownership within an organization is that people can actually participate in negotiating it. Doesn't mean they're right about everything, and so what we do is we help that process unfold coherently. So there's a whole bag of tricks and theories and different things we've had to put together to be able to do that. But back to your original question, the mentor, their role is, I wouldn't think of them as a teacher. I wouldn't think of them as a Mr. Miyagi. I wouldn't think of them as an instructor. Let me stray for just a second and use a classroom teacher.
Yeah.
A classroom teacher is kind of like a magician. I've really started to see them as magicians because they conjure up this entire learning situation. Like they completely create the situation for learning. If done well, they've created. If not done well, it's not created, and it's chaos, right? When you're in an organizational environment, like this environment, this manufacturing environment, the mentor doesn't have to conjure up the situation. The situation exists independently of both the mentor and the apprentice. The mentor has to give, for this to be an effective learning experience, the conditions have to exist for the apprentice to have authentic access to it. So we talk about designing the conditions, and one of the conditions is mentor awareness, that for the apprentice to learn, they have to be able to they have to participate in authentic activity. That could be observation. That could be actually doing the work. And so that's the role of the mentor, is to not to, and Wenger again on community practice talks about this, it's to pull them in from the periphery into the center of practice. Like the whole goal of the program is these practices in this organization, the curriculum, exist independently of any one person. And the goal is for us all to move towards the center of that practice. And the mentor's job is to bring the apprentices along with them.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the image of bringing them into the center. The lonely path of almost the factory implied process of best practices and whatnot is rife with error, and bringing them into the center. It's also sort of I almost see it as like you're succeeding and failing in daylight. Like, you know what I mean? Like you're you you have immediate feedback if it's done in a collective manner in the center, right? You can see that, oh, that thing I just didn't work. I have to adjust here, whatever, as opposed to waiting till the end of the day when the foreman can say, or the teacher can say, back here at hour 2, you did this other thing wrong, so I can appreciate that. I also feel like you're describing every scenario where I was given the opportunity to succeed in my own career. Like, I can think of times as you're describing this ownership is negotiated piece. I remember one time I was being taught about a new technology that my company was selling, and I had to learn about some very sophisticated aspects of this technology and how to present it very clearly. And I was given sort of a rubric and a way in which to learn it. And then I was judged by an engineer that had the facts, and then my boss who had sort of the sales leadership role. And I remember watching them argue because the person in the engineering role said, no, you got to go back. You missed this, you missed that, you missed this other thing. And then my boss was like, no, I disagree. He just actually described it in a different order, but did it in his own way, and it made complete sense. And for this reason, like, so there was I was brought into the center, right? I was, and it wasn't about being right or wrong. It was about how we all learned together that, through that educational experience, what made what I did valid in that particular case, right? But yeah, that sounds, it's really interesting that this works, that what you're describing is sort of a framework and a set of principles. Obviously, you're talking about research and some great data on this that applies. I guess going back to higher ed, if we're to kind of apply this more broadly, clearly what you're talking about has great implications for how we do teacher education. It's a great example of an area where there's lots of room for improvement. I've spoken to many people in both at the faculty level and dean level in colleges of education who would not disagree that they have a lot of work to do to improve the state of their teaching education, and many of which are very excited by the idea of being able to do the apprenticeship model. But even beyond education, what are some areas in higher ed that you've identified or gotten feedback on that you feel like you'd like to approach next beyond teacher education? And what would be kind of reasons for going into different types of programs from your perspective?
So I met with the president of Mechanical Contractor Association yesterday. I was at the Indiana Manufacturers Association conference yesterday, so I've had a couple good conversations. Everybody, and this is applicable to the previous conversation of the previous topic. Everybody, what I'm hearing is it's getting easier and easier to bring people in and teach them the technical skills. What they're describing as the gap in these industries is leadership capability. And makes a lot of sense. You can learn a lot of these skill sets as an individual, right? To take the formal model, I'm learning this skill set. I was told to learn this. Now I'm learning it, right? By myself or through direct instruction. But leadership is something that's learned different. It can't be directly taught. It's learned through a process. It's learned through circumstances. And the first leadership role that a lot of these industries are talking about that's becoming a huge need is technicians. And so I'm really curious right now about the pump industry. I see the pump manufacturing industry. I'm really interested in the advanced manufacturing industry. Like the more technology increases, what's happened throughout history is every time we increase technology, one, it does redistribute the workforce. You automate certain parts of the workforce, but you create higher levels. You have to have you have more levels of higher order thinking, because now they need to understand the context of what this technology is doing. You don't have all of that at the individual level anymore. Now you have to have people that can see at a systems level. So yeah, really interested in advanced manufacturing, other areas of manufacturing, like the pump industry, like I mentioned. All the equipment's getting more complicated. But I'm quite curious about, even like the healthcare field. There's a lot of movement right now in nursing, in the medical field. But I think I think what I wanted to go to was if this problem in the higher ed level can be solved in teaching, I think it probably could be solved almost anywhere in higher ed. And here's why. The practice of teaching kids, I don't know that that's invalid. The pedagogical approach to teaching students. I think, these are kids. Kids do learn differently than adults. Adults learn differently than kids. So the hard part for teaching, I would think in K-12 and in higher ed, is that the way adults learn the practice of pedagogy is different than pedagogy itself. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
And so other industries don't really, if I'm learning engineering, I'm in this formal education model in higher ed taking engineering courses, but I'm not practicing pedagogy. I'm practicing engineering. So I think it's a much smaller leap than what education actually has to go through.
Yeah. I mean, when we talk about work integrated learning, and we kind of answered it along the way, like you and I had a conversation before, about work integrated learning versus what you were calling work generated learning, concept of high impact practices. There's so many well studied reasons to take a much more thoughtful approach to flipping the learning into being more giving more agency to the learner and giving them more ownership over their learning in the context of the learning. There's just great research and data on why internships, why apprenticeships, why work integrated learning. No one needs to be convinced of it, right? Like what you're doing is you're taking it to the next level, which is like really trying to understand the science of where it breaks down and where the opportunity is to really scale. And I think that there's a ton of opportunity across higher ed. You're right, engineering and otherwise. I also think that there's a great opportunity as a great equalizer. The more we get this right, like what you're talking about in teacher training, the more this levels the playing field for all different types of learners. Mm-hmm. What we learn about from our friends like Major League Hacking and hackathons is that really the student at the community college and the student at the highly rejective university, when they're drawn into a hackathon to work on a project together, there's no difference between them. They actually, by working together in community, are able to achieve the same level of success. You start to blur the lines between who those students even are. And that's an interesting proxy for, as you think about increasing enrollment, if one of your differentiators was to increase enrollment into programs that were more experiential and were more driven by the kind of practice that you're a proponent of. Mm-hmm. I also think that the pool of potential students that can benefit from it is increased significantly. Like, to your point, adult learners, and people that are already in the profession, and then students who are regular college age and beyond. Everybody can have the same opportunity. I think there's great data to support that. And so if to see you succeed in the context of teaching or manufacturing does open the aperture here for a ton of other disciplines. So you guys have a pretty big vision for this, and you're seeing good success already in several different areas. I wonder, several years out, what is the version of this that's normal, 5 years from now, in a college context, versus what today is just sort of exceptional or novel? How do you see this scaling?
I'm going to throw out something abstract, and then we can try to go into specifics. But I'll start with the problem right now. Like we talked about, there's a very narrow view of what learning is and what knowing is. There's kind of a universal approach. It's a universal experience. If I were to say what the future of higher education could look like, it is actually higher learning, in the sense that it has broadened society's view of what it means to know. To know is fundamentally human. And so when you reduce the experience of knowing, you reduce the human experience. And so for a lot of people, it's reducing their human experience. Not everybody, but I mean, that's a harsh claim, but that was my experience growing up. I just couldn't explain it that way. Higher learning could become where the ways that we understand knowing and learning are very broad. And to go along with that, higher ed has, and I think this is part of our work, and I'm in conversations with some institutions about this, the higher ed, it can't just trust that knowing is happening. There has to be some analysis. I think I recognize that. I recognize it just can be like, okay, yeah, this is happening. I think the problem is analysis. The model we had is easy to analyze. These other models are much more slippery. So we've got to come to an understanding of how to analyze those, but we can't take these other ways and squeeze them into the traditional paradigm, because that's you get something else. And that's what's happened throughout the last 100 years. You just see people appropriating things and squeezing it into a paradigm, and it's not the original idea. So I think there's a way to broaden this thing out. I think it's going to take some work on, but let's just say vision wise, all these things can be reconciled. All the ways we know can be reconciled within higher education as a way of analyzing, and higher education can become our partner in practice in navigating the communities we're in. Because if you go into that manufacturing environment, it's kind of comical, because you wouldn't expect it. Like, I didn't bring I didn't bring an industry practice to them. I brought an academic practice to them. I brought theory. I brought a ton of theory. I brought a ton of frameworks and concepts. These blue collar guys on the floor, their hands are black and dirty and grimy. they're asking the apprentices, did you get all your reflections in? You have to do your reflections to be a good practice researcher, as they're tearing apart motors. Like there is
Right.
a thirst for the academic discipline, but higher ed has gotten its discipline confused with content, and content's cheap. AI's proven that. And
Mm.
so higher ed has to go back to what is the discipline it offers, and it's a legitimate discipline. Inquiry is a legitimate discipline. Help us do that well. Help us do that well across our different communities, across these different ways of knowing. Analyze it so that we can have some standard of assessment for accreditation purposes, if you will. So that's kind of that's a vision I think is possible. It's abstract. It's going to require some stomach for wrestling with those sorts of things. But
Yeah.
that's the stuff I'm frankly super excited about.
Well, no, I'm game for the abstraction, and I think, if I take your concept, you're inviting higher ed and accreditation into the space of learning in, we'll call it, work generated learning. Like, you're inviting higher ed into that, and by doing that, you can. We had a conversation the other day with one of my clients in a panel of enrollment leaders, where one of the enrollment leaders talked about a vision for the future where there were no majors. And what was interesting about that parallels to this is that, getting someone to declare a major when they first enter college, say straight out of high school, is a pretty ridiculous premise to begin with. Like, it's a pretty difficult concept. But I think, rather than worry about all the programs and protecting the existing programs, if you could take higher ed and accreditation and validation work into industry, into the places where knowledge gets applied, and surround those community of practices with ways to validate and scaffold that learning that's taking place, that is an interesting and very radical concept of where higher ed could go.
In that manufacturing environment, even though we're not technically an institution, we're bringing a higher ed, like the principles that we did in that manufacturing environment, the things we're training apprentices and mentors on, is not their practices, it's these concepts. Same thing we're doing in teaching. So it's an academic practice. And I think organizations could find a lot of value in that. And higher ed could be, work-generated learning is not going to be for everybody. So I think for active practitioners, work-generated learning is the next step. I think for traditional pre-practitioner students, work integrated learning seems appropriate. So I think the categories haven't quite been sorted out, and I think we really have to understand the student experience in terms of their practice to be able to build the learning experience the right way. So I think that's part of the vision too, is that can all get sorted out, and we have ways of thinking about the student experience and in designing it appropriately to be a partner in their practice, whatever that is.
Yeah. Well, let's entangle. let's get entangled together, and
it's working.
I do agree. There's never any one panacea, but I do agree that there needs to be significant, and there's a thirst for really significant reform, and entangled learning can be a really big piece of that in these contexts. And I look forward to hearing more about what you guys are doing and what you're building over time. Appreciate you taking the time to do this today.
Yeah, likewise. It's great.